So Shavua Tov again. Today is Daf Lamed Chet 38 in Sechet Avodah Zarah. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what there's background maybe. Okay, Daf Lamed Chet today. Again, Shavua Tov. So we are up to 7 or 8 lines from the bottom of Daf Lamed Zayin on the bet. The next thing we said in the Mishnah that is asur to eat if it comes from a non-Jew is something called shlakot. What are shlakot? Shlakot generally means things that are boiled, like vegetables or fruit or things like that. Ask the Gemara, how do you know that? How do you know that if a non-Jew cooks something, you're not allowed to have it? Menani mili. Amar b'chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra. It's actually based on the pasuk that we have in this week's parsha coming up, where it says, Ochel b'kesef tashpireni, that food I bought with money from, this is from Sichon, that I wanted to buy food from them, v'achalti to eat, umayim b'kesef titein liv shatiti. I asked him for water with money to drink. And what the pasuk is saying is that food that you buy from a non-Jew has to be like water. Kimayim. Just like water, you don't change. Water is the way it was created, essentially. You can only buy food that's unchanged, meaning not cooked. It says Gemara, well, 1 second. If food can't be changed, let's say you take grain and instead of cooking it, you roast it, right? You pop it like popped corn or popped wheat. Implies that would be usher also. But you say, yeah, maybe it is usher. Atanya, but there's a brayta that says the chitin v'asan klayot mutarin. If you have wheat and you just pop it, that's not considered cooking. It's not bishul akum. You're allowed to have it. Why? It's not like water. Ella says, where you're right. Let's read it. Let's darshan the pasuk this way. Kim mayim. Food has to be like water. Ma mayim shtanu mibir yatan. Water is not changed from the way it looks, meaning it doesn't appear different. Food can't be changed, meaning if you just take the grain or corn and you pop it, you can tell that that's the original thing. But if you grind it up and make it into wheat or cook it, then it will be changed. Well, if that's the case, then let's say you have chitin, you have grain, wheat, and you grind it, so then flour should be prohibited even if it's not cooked, right? Because basically the pasuk is saying food has to be like water, and you change the food, you no longer can buy it from a non-Jew. And if you say, in fact, that's the truth. But Tanya, but there's another brayta that says, clearly to anticipate this, that in fact, if you have grain, wheat, and you turn it into popped wheat, or kambachim usalatot shelahen, and different kinds of flour, right? Kemach and solid are different fine flours, and solid is very fine. Kemach is a little coarser. Shelahen mutarim. These are permitted. So you are allowed to buy flour from a non-Jew. The way we dash it might be like mayim, that just like water, so now we're adding like layers of complication, right? Just like water, which is not changed from the way it looks, through fire, right? Meaning by cooking or by baking. So therefore, any food that you buy from a non-Jew has to be something that was not changed through fire. Well, that's already, you're adding a condition that has nothing to do with the pasuk. The pasuk says water. It doesn't say anything about fire, about lighting a flame in the pasuk. It says more than on top of Daf Lamed Chet and Aleph. Ella, you're right. Midrabanan. The truth is, we're trying to find the smach in the pasuk, which doesn't exist. This prohibition is midrabanan. Ukra asmachta ba'alma, and the verse itself is just there to support it. That the Torah is basically telling you don't buy things from a non-Jew unless they're like water. So, but it's not an exact limud. It's just midrabanan. Now, very controversially, the question is, what's the Isser Drabanan? So Rashi here says that the reason that you're not allowed to eat something cooked by a non-Jew is because we're afraid they're going to put food in it that's not kosher. That they'll give you something yechilenu davar tamei, which of course would have big implications, because if you had a hashgacha, if you had something like that, it might not be a big problem according to Rashi. Tosfot here says, and this has been a discussion throughout the Gemara, that it's not because of, it's not only, let's say, because of that, but it's really because of chatnut, right? Which is the issue that you're going to go and become familiar with them and marry their children, right? And so it's a very interesting. Tosfot here actually brings a very important machloket between two Bali Tosfot, Rabbi Avram Reb David and Rabbi Benotam, about what happens if a non-Jew cooks in your house, right? There's one Bali Tosfot who says it's not a problem because you're not going to their house, so it doesn't matter. And it wouldn't be an Isser. It's only if you go to them that it's a problem, not if they come to you. And Tosfot and Reino Tam disagrees and says, no, they answered everything. So clearly, we'll get to the Gemara, of course, but these are issues that are very, very practical halacha and for different opinions.
Well, there's one word in Rashi. I think that's important. Maybe I didn't hear you say it, but Rashi says Shelo Yisra Ragil, that a Jew shouldn't become accustomed to eating these foods. Ragil, I think, is an important word.
Well, so that is true. It is important, but the question is why? What's the problem with becoming ragil? So again, Rashi here says, not everywhere, I think in the Mishnah he said different, that it's because we're afraid something will be davar tameh, right? That they'll feed you something that's tameh. Again, these are the two reasons we've had consistently, right? Either it's a davar yain nesech, or it's because of chatzanut, and sometimes both, like I said. Says the word on the top line of Lamachet Amar Aleph. Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Amar Rav Kol Hanechal Kamot Shu Chayim Mishum Bishul Akum. And these are a lot of people know these halachot. Anything that is eaten raw, so you cook it, but you don't need to cook it. I'll take carrots, for example. You don't have to worry about Bishul Akum. Bisura Matni Hachi. Now that's how they taught Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Amar Rav in Surah. But in Pumpadita, remember a different part of Bavel, they taught Matni Hachi. Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Amar Rav. Anything that is not brought on the table of kings to enhance the way bread is eaten, meaning it's a big debate about what the bread has to do with any of this, but that essentially it's a food that's eaten with bread, because that's considered not an achilat arai. It's not something you just popcorn maybe, or you just eat. It's something that's put on bread and eaten in a meal. Then ein bo mishum bishulei akum. Then it doesn't have to worry about bishul akum, because again, in either case, presumably you're not going to rely on them. You're not going to do it consistently. You don't think it's chashuv. Maybe there's a lot of why it didn't matter, and you don't have to worry about bishul akum even if they cooked it in those situations. My benayu. Now, what's interesting? The two versions. Things, for example, dagim tanim, things like small fish. And ardi and daisa, ardi is Rashi's kmian and pitriot, like mushrooms and little fungi probably, and daisa, which means like a porridge that you make where you don't grind the grain, but you just sort of crush it and then cook it. These are things that generally you don't eat raw, right? You don't eat dagim, you don't eat daisa raw, but they're not chashuv, they're not eaten for a major meal. And therefore, according to the second opinion, because they're not eaten shulchan melachim, they're mutar, even if they're cooked by a non-Jew. But since they're not eaten raw, according to the first opinion, they would be prohibited. Amar Rabasi Marav. Now it says Rabasi Marav, what about dagim ktanim meluchim? What about small fish that you don't cook, but you what's it called? You salt them, right? So you don't cook these things, you put them in salt, and they, I don't know, I guess whatever reason you're able to eat them, right? Like we know. That's not considered bishul, because even though essentially salting them is the way you cook them, it's not a fire, it's not cooked. Rav Yosef. Now says Rav Yosef, in fact, in Salan, if you do end up cooking these fish, since you could eat them without cooking them, if a non-Jew roasts them, in fact, you're allowed to use them for Erev Tavshilin. Remember, for Erev Tavshilin, you need to have a cooked food. So the fact that they're pickled or salted is not enough. But if they're cooked, it's enough, because since you could eat them without cooking them, the fact that the guy cooked them does not make them a problem. But yavidnu goy kasa daharsanna asur. However, if the non-Jew, Aveikum Chavim, made them into a kasa daharsanna, and kasa daharsanna is a thing we've talked about a lot of times in brachot, where you had basically a dish that had oil and was fried, and fish, basically. So you take these dried fish, you mix them with oil and flour and make like a cake. So that is asur, because pshita, obviously it's asur, the guy cooked it. So ma'adatema, you might have thought harsana ikar. Look, the main thing here is the fish, and remember, the fish is not a problem because it's salted, and so it's not cooked, or it doesn't need to be cooked. In fact, the chiddush here is that in this dish, again, whatever the dish was, the flour and the oil were the main things, and the fish was like a tasting thing, it was a little extra. And since the flour is the main thing, a guy who cooks flour is prohibited because of bishul akum. Amar Rav Bruna Amar Rav. Says Rav Bruna Amar Rav, a very interesting halacha, we're around 15 lines down from the top. Says Rav Bruna Amar Rav, goy, or Aveiku Chavim, again, I have different girsot in my when I'm using it online or inside. But the Gersa is consistent here. A non-Jew, shehitzit et ha'or ba'agam. This is a very interesting case. You have a non-Jew who lights a fire in a agam. Usually, we translate agam as a swamp or a meadow in a field, right? So he lights a fire in this field, and then the next day you go through the field, and of course there are many, many dead bugs in the field because they were all burnt by the fire. Now they used to eat grasshoppers. Some of the grasshoppers were kosher, and basically you got a bunch of roasted grasshoppers that are cooked on this field. So says Rav Bruna Marav, you can't eat those grasshoppers. Koach hagavim sheba'agam asurim. You're not allowed to eat the grasshoppers that you find. Now we don't know exactly why. So hechidami, what are these? What's the case of these grasshoppers? Maybe the problem is that they're burnt beyond recognition. So you can't tell which grasshoppers were tahar or tamei. Well, if that's the case, my area oveiko chavim. It's not because the non-Jew started the fire; it's because you can't recognize them. I feel Yisrael nami. Same thing would be true about a Jew who started the fire. Ela mishum bishuli goy bakum. The problem here is that the guy started the fire, so he or she cooked the grasshoppers. And so therefore, since he or she cooked the grasshoppers, you're not allowed to eat these things that are even accidentally cooked by a non-Jew. Is that true? In fact, is that the case? Is it true that in this case it would be prohibited? Right? Let's say you have a case where you kill an animal, you shecht an animal properly, and before you cook it, a non-Jew is working in your factory, and he wants to get rid of all the hair on the animal. Instead of scraping it off or cutting it off, I don't know how they remove hair exactly, he uses fire. He burns the hair. So he basically lights the head of the animal on fire, right, in order to get rid of the hair. And by accident, while he's doing it, he cooks some of the animal. Shari lemechamine, you're allowed to eat that. Even the tip of the ear, which is a very tiny thing that you can cook it very easily. So you have these beautiful roasted ears made by the goy. It doesn't matter because since he made the fire in order to remove the hair, not in order to cook it, it's not considered to be bishul akum. The reason he did the fire is to get rid of the hair, and therefore it's not prohibited. So why is the agam a problem? Right, this guy burned the grass or the marsh in order to get rid of the grasses, right? To reveal the agam, maybe to open up the field. He didn't intend to cook the grasshopper. So why would it be aser for shom bishul akum? Says, well, you're right. In fact, the reason that you're not allowed to eat the locust in this case, it's lo yada hai tahar v'hai tamei, because you can't recognize which ones are tahar and which ones are tamei. So why does it a non-Jew? It could be the same thing by a Jew. It's true. It's just a funny story that happened with a non-Jew. If the story happened with a Jew, it would have been the same halacha. So in fact, it has nothing to do with the fact that it's bishul akum. Has to do with the fact that you can't recognize the animals. Gufa. Let's go back to this interesting halacha where if a non-Jew cooks something, but did it in order to do a different function, it's not considered cooking. So last narrow line. Who burns the head of an animal to get rid of the hair. You can eat from that, even though he ended up cooking it. Even the tip of the ear, which is very easy to cook. Ravina, says Ravina Hilkach. Therefore, I have a very important halacha, which is, let's say you have an oveiku chavim, the shada sichta la'atuna. He took a sichta is like a piece of wood that's wet, right? And he threw it into an oven in order for it to dry out and harden, right? And this was often part of the way they process things, is that you let the water into it and then you burn it and dry it out. It doesn't burn up, it just hardens the thing. So a non-Jew basically put a piece of wood into an oven and stoked the oven in order to cook or to harden the wood or dry out the wood. Now, it happens to be kavar ba Yisrael kara me'ikara. A Jew previously had buried a kara, a pumpkin, a gourd, in the floor of this oven. So the guy turns on the oven to heat up his stick, and he cooks your pumpkin. Says the Gemara, that's not a problem. Shaper dummy. You're allowed to eat the pumpkin because he's not intending to cook your food. He's intending to heat up his piece of wood. There's my pshita. Okay, that seems like the exact same thing that we just said. That if the guy is mechavein for something else, you're allowed to use his cooking. Says where, well, you might have thought that that's considered to be cooking because basically he's trying to cook, quote unquote, his piece of wood, not to eat it, but to make it harder. Kamashman, that's not really what we call cooking. The sharuri manaka mechavin, he's just trying to fix or to harden his piece of wood, not to cook it, and therefore it's not considered to be bishul akam, and you can eat it. But of course, if he went in to cook his lunch, and your lunch was also in the oven, that would be a problem, because although he's not meaning to cook your thing, he's meaning to cook something. Now, says Rav Yudah Mishmo, another halacha that's in the same idea is hiniach Yisrael basar gabi gichalim. Let's say a Jew puts down a piece of steak on or piece of meat on top of coals, uba ove kochavim hipechbo, and someone at the barbecue, right? The non-Jew comes and he turns it over, right? He turns over the meat in order to cook it. Mutar. That's not considered to be cooked by the non-Jew. Says what is the case? If the case is that even had he not touched it, would have cooked, he was just, making himself busy in the kitchen by mixing things around. Pshita, he didn't do anything. It must be where if he didn't turn it over, it wouldn't have cooked. So then am I mutar? Why is it permitted? He was essential in cooking it. It's bishul of a non-Jew, right? So why would it be permitted? Says, well, you're right. It's talking about a case that's in between. It's talking about a case, if he hadn't turned it over, it would have cooked in 2 hours, right? Or whatever, a long time. Because he turned it over, it cooked faster. It cooked in an hour. So it would have cooked without the non-Jew, but it would have cooked slower. I might have thought that it should be prohibited because krove bishula miltahi, that rushing some cooking, hastening the cooking is considered to be an action of cooking. Kamashman, that it's not. That since it would have cooked from the Jew, the fact that the non-Jew turned up the fire or moved the food is not a problem. Says Gemara, but we had another statement, which is very well known, that in fact, kol shehu kemachal ben drosai, anything that's cooked, eating edible for ben drosai. Remember ben drosai, we always talk about were these bandits who didn't have, they hid out in caves and they ran away and they didn't have time to cook their food. So they would cook their food a minimum amount and then they would eat it. So we learned from Rabbi Yochanan that if you have a food that's previously cooked by a Jew, machal ben drusai, a quarter of the way, we have different, this is very relevant for Shabbos, right? But we have a few different ways of looking at this. But let's say it's edible, but it's still raw. Then, ein bo mishum bishlei avoid kochavim. Then if a non-Jew comes and finishes it, you don't have to worry about cooking. But that implies that if it was Eino Kimachal Ben Drusai, let's say I put the steak down and it's 3 minutes later, if a non-Jew came and turned it over, it is Yeshbo Eino Kimachal Ben Drusai. If it's not cooked by a Jew, Kimachal Ben Drusai, Yeshbo Mishum Bishuli Akum, right? Then there is a problem of cooking. So how could you say that if it would have cooked by the Jew action, even if it would have taken days, or not days, but hours, the non-Jew's cooking doesn't matter. Rabbi Yochanan said it has to be cooked Kimachal Ben Drusai. Says, well, that's different. Hatam, there, it's talking about where the food is not on the flame. You go into otve basilta. The food is sitting in the basket, meaning the non-Jew takes the food from the counter or from the fridge or whatever they had in the basket and puts it on the flame. Then, basically, he's reheating it. If it was already cooked at least a minimum amount, then the non-Jew is no bishul achar bishul, as we would say, right? He's not cooking it. It was already cooked. He's just heating it up. That's not a problem. But here, right, and there, so there the case is he took it out of the counter, out of the basket, and put it on the oven. There, it has to be cooked kimachal ben drosai. Our case is where the Jew put it on the oven or on the flames, and then it's not cooked at all. But he did that action. If the non-Jew then moves it on the flames, it's not considered to be cooking of a non-Jew. And Tanya Namihachi, in fact, there's a braita that says this clearly. Miniach Yisrael basar gabi gichalim. A Jew can put down food on top of gichalim. Again, these are incredibly relevant halachot, just for the record. We are 3 lines in the bottom of Lamed Chet Amud Aleph. Yisrael can put meat on top of coals. And if ba ovei kochavim mahapechbo, if a non-Jew comes and turns it over to make the food cook faster, that's fine. Jews, he's at shul or he's in the Beit Midrash, he's learning Daf Yomi. In a choshesh, you can leave a non-Jew to look at the flames and to look at your food. Or shofeted isha kedera gabi kira, a woman can put out a pot on top of a kira as a stove. Remember, right? Not coals, but they had the closed stoves, and you would have coals inside and put the pot on top. Yeah, that's not a problem. you can have an Oved Kochavim, her friend, can come and can mix it. Sorry, turn the page to Daf Lamed Chet Amud Bet. Ad shetavo, the girsa here is a little unclear. Our girsa says Ad shetavo mi Beit HaMerchatz mi Beit HaKnesset, until she comes home from either the bathhouse or from Beit HaKnesset, from Shul. And you don't have to worry, because since the Jew put it on the flame, it doesn't matter if the non-Jew is there stoking the flame or turning it around. The fact is that if it would have cooked from the action of the Jew, that's considered to be bishul of a Yisrael, not of an akum.
We said before that a Jew, that if the goy doesn't have kavanah to do it, it doesn't count as if he's cooking it, right?
Correct. If he's doing the fire for a different purpose.
Now, there is halacha, I believe, that mitzvah lo tzricha kavanah, like in tefillah, kriya shema, and so forth. So if we follow that, then we would say that if he has no kavanah here, it would be yotze. The person is yotze b'mitzvah, filo below kavanah. So in this case, it's as if we apply that, the goy would be yotze in cooking it here.
Well, there's no mitzvah to cook it. What do you mean?
I'm not calling by mitzvah, but the point is with the idea, if a person can be yotzi b'mitzvah, a filo below kavanah, and the goy is cooking it below kavanah, why wouldn't we say it's considered cooked by the goy?
So I mean, I don't think those things, it's not the same standard, right? The issue with the non-Jew cooking, as we said earlier, it depends. It's a debate. It's either because you're afraid they're going to put in something that's not kosher, or you're afraid that you're going to become ragil with them. Like any takana, there's circumstances which are similar and which are not. Why they decided some cases, it's sufficient if the Jew puts it on the flame and starts it. It's hard to explain. Obviously, what we always say, it's not similar to the original takana, but I don't think it's not a question of kavanah in this case per se. But it is clear that the only prohibition, according to our Gemara, and this is the way it's brought, but the implications are quite varied in our kitchens, right, is if the non-Jew had intention to light the flame to cook, in order to cook food. Now, iboilo, we get to some more cases.
No, we're not talking about lighting the flame. We're saying he throws his wood in there, right? The flame may have been lit by the Jew, but he's throwing his wood in there, and then the gourd is cooked by mistake. He didn't intend to cook the pumpkin. But but I'm saying is that if we're holding to another level, a mitzvah that is where yotze b'li kavanah, why not say that here that goy cooks b'li kavanah? It would be yotze, it would be as if the goy cooked it.
Right. So again, I think the concepts are not the same, right?
I understand that, but I mean, you see the idea.
I certainly see the idea. I agree. Mitzvot tzricha kavanah is similar. But let's read the case of pot, because the case of pot actually talks about what you just mentioned, which is the question of putting in the fire and stoking the fire, which are two separate acts. So Iboilo says the Gemara, what about the following case? Let's say Let's say the opposite happened, right? So the case we just had was where a Yisrael put the food in, and then a non-Jew came and turned it over to make it cook faster, and we said that's okay. What if the non-Jew put the food on the flame, and the Yisrael came and turned it over to make it cook faster? Mo, what's the halacha? So you might think, oh, that's a problem, right? It says it's not a problem. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kal v'chomer. In fact, that is permitted from a kal v'chomer. That if gemaro biyad ovei kochavim mutar, right? If it's finished, meaning the main cooking is done by a non-Jew, and that's okay as long as the Jew started it. If it's gemaro biyad Yisrael lo kol shekain, if a Yisrael finishes it, that's for sure okay. So basically, it's a huge heter, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, that either one is okay. If the non-Jew put it on and the Jew cooked it, it doesn't matter if the non-Jew put the first thing on the flame. The fact that the Jew is instrumental in cooking it is enough. And the opposite is also true. If the Yisrael put it on, even if the non-Jew was instrumental in cooking it, that's not a problem. So it's a heter on both ends. And in Marnami, we actually said this very explicitly. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rami Lamar Vachabar Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bein Sheiniach Ovei Kochavim B'Afach Yisrael. Whether the non-Jew was the one who put it on and the Yisrael is the one who turns it over and finishes the cooking, or the opposite, Bein Sheiniach Yisrael B'Afach Ovei Kochavim Mutar. Either way, if a Jew is involved in the beginning or the end, it's permitted to eat that food. It's not bishol akum. Ve'eno asur ad shnei tchilato ugmaro b'yad ovei kochavim. In fact, it's not prohibited unless you have the beginning and the end by a non-Jew. And further, now the next lines are really, really relevant in halacha and incredibly useful in what we end up doing. Says Ravina, Amar Ravina Hilchata, halacha is high rifta. If you have a piece of bread, dis shagar ovei kochavim b'afa Yisrael. So if the non-Jew lights the fire, right, in the stove, but they're baked by Yisrael, right? The way they would bake bread is you put in the oven on the side, let's say, and it will cook up, right? Or inami shagar Yisrael, if the Jew lit the flame, va'afa ovei kochavim, and the non-Jew baked the cake, right? Baked the bread. Inami, or there's a third category, which is shagar ovei kochavim, va'afa ovei kochavim. The non-Jew lights the fire, the non-Jew cooks the bread, the Jew comes and he stokes the coals. He moves over the coals and makes the fire hotter. In all of those cases, shapir dami, that is enough to be considered cooked by a Jew. And this, of course, is a huge kula that we rely on tremendously, right? If the Jew lights the flame, right? If the Jew does any of the action, there's a big Ramah brings several opinions. I can tell you how I think he paskins about whether this is true only about bread, which is what it sounds like, or whether it's true about all food. And I think that the opinion the Ramah, he brings both opinions. I think he says halacha, or we can rely on this for everything. So we do sometimes, maybe not everyone. There's a big machloket about this, about whether this is a halacha only for bread because bread cooks faster and it's easier, or it's halacha for everything. And as long as the Jew lights the flame, which is of course the big heter of a lot of kashrut, right? Then it's considered to be bishul of Yisrael. Again, these halachot are very relevant and beyond the scope of Daf Yomi. But that is halacha of bishul akum. Continues the Gemara now. Dag maliach, right? Let's say we are, 20 lines from the top, the first word on the middle of the narrow lines. It's a long daf. Well, let's say you've got, let's go fast. You have a fish that is salted. So that's not cooked, it's salted. So Chizkiah says that's fine. You can eat a dag maliach made by a non-Jew. And Rabbi Yochanan aser. Rabbi Yochanan says it's prohibited. What about bitzat sluya? What about an egg that's roasted? So Bar Kapara Shari, Rabbi Yochanan asir. Now, why does Bar Kapara say it's permitted? You cooked an egg. So Bar Kapara, she explains, Bar Kapara says it's permitted because the egg is covered by its shell. And so basically the non-Jew really never handled the thing that you cooked. He only handled the outside, and that's not considered to be cooked or enough of bishul akum. That's a machloket. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said, Echad dag maliach, echad beitzat sluya, both of these cases of a salted fish and an egg that's roasted, Chizkiah bar kapara sharu, both Chizkiah and bar kapara said it's permitted, and Rabbi Yochanan said it's asur, so it's prohibited. Now Rabbi Chia Parva iklal be'reish galuta. Once Rabbi Chia Parva came in Bavel to the house of Reish Galuta, Amrlei and the Reish Galuta assistant said to Rabbi Chia, Beitzat sluya mai, what's the story? Our non-Jewish workers are making our eggs. Is that okay? Amrlei said to him, well, it's a machloket in Eretz Yisrael. Chizkiah bar kapara shari. Chizkiah bar kapara said it's permitted. Rabbi Yochanan said it's asur. And 1 against 2 doesn't count. So we don't listen to Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore it is permitted. Said Rav Zvid, I'm going to Rav Zvid, lo tetzitule. Don't listen to him. He's wrong. Hachi Amar Abaya said, Hilchata kamtei de Rabbi Yochanan. Halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, and you're not allowed to eat an egg that's roasted by a non-Jew. Now, the Beirish Gluta did not like this, because maybe their favorite meal were eggs. And Ashkuye Netuga, the Chala, they gave him this drink of very strong vinegar, and Nach Nafshi, and they killed him because they were so upset with him. Everyone wonders what this means. But either way, they were very angry with this psak, and they punished him. Tanura Banan. Now says the Braita, the following things: kafrisan, which are capers, right, little berries, kaplatot, which here it translates it as leeks. Mitalya, I don't know what mitalya is. We're going to ask in a second what it is. I mean, I do know because of the Gemara, but the Gemara is going to ask in a second. Hachamin, hot water. Haklayot, things that are roasted that we had earlier today. Shelahen, mutarin. Those are all permitted to be cooked by a non-Jew, mostly because they're eaten when they're raw or because it's not considered cooking. But a beitzat sluya, but an egg that's roasted, asura. Now shemen, what about oil? Remember this we had in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasiu beitino nimnu alav hetiru. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his beitin, or Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya later, were nimnu, and they permitted oil from a non-Jew. Now Tanya, ask the Braita, explains the Braita, what is a mitalya? Hi mitalya is a pasilya. Now what's a pasilya? That's a shi'ata, which is some kind of peas, some kind of bean. My shi'ata, asked the Gemara, Amar Abba Bar Chanan Rabbi Yochanan, said Rabbi Bar Chanan named Rabbi Yochanan, Arba'in Shnin Dinafik Hay Uvda B'Mitzrayim. We heard this story from Egypt 40 years ago, meaning this method, I'm about to tell you a recipe. This recipe came to us from Egypt 40 years ago. It's popularized. And Rabbi Bar Chanan Didem, Rabbi Bar Chanan himself said it came 60 years ago from Egypt. Hashit and Shnin Dinafik Hay Uvda B'Mitzrayim. We heard this from Egypt 60 years ago, and of course they don't argue. Though please says Mar B'Shnei, Mar B'Shnei. Right? In Rabbi Yochanan's time, it was 40 years, and Rabbi Bar Chanan's time, it was 60 years. So this was an ancient recipe that they had from Egypt. What's the recipe? Maita bizra, they would take bizra de carpissa. Okay, I have some English that's helping me out here. They would take seeds from a karpas, from a parsley, if that's what you do for karpas, right? Ubizra de kitna, and they would take seeds from flax. Ubizra de shavlalita, and seeds of a shavlalita, which it says in mine is fenugreek, right? So they would take these different kinds of bizra doesn't mean it's like roots, right? In flax and in the fenugreek. The tarule bahadi adadi peshuri, they would soak them together in like peshuri means like lukewarm water, so not hot water, but like room temperature or warm water. The shavkale adim kabel, they would leave them until they started sprouting, okay, in the water. And then there would be mighty chatzvei chadati. They would take new pots, new earthenware pots, umolu maya, they'd fill them up with water. The tarabu gargishta, they would put this gargishta, which is some kind of clay that they would put in it, like a red colored clay, umdapkimbe, and they would line the seeds in the clay. So they would take these flowering seeds or these sprouting seeds and put them in the clay in the wall of this pot. The island, the Bebani, they would put it into the bathhouse, which I guess was very humid and very hot, or it was just very fast. And Abdinafki, from at the time they were leaving, meaning in a very short time, milavlovely, they would start blossoming. They would start sprouting. They were sprouting. They would start blossoming. And achni minayo, and then they would eat these seeds or these flowers. Vikarya mibinte de reshayo atufa de charayo. It would chill you. It would cool you down, take away your fever and your heat from the top of your head into the reshayim, the hair on your head, to the bottom of your toenails, tufa de karayo, the nails of your feet. So this was some kind of like magic thing that would basically grow in these pots in the heat and would cause a great feeling. It says Rav Ashi Amar Li Rabbi Chanina. So Rav Ashi Rabbi Chanina told me milin, but this is just words, meaning this is an old wives' tale. Nothing grows in a bathhouse in minutes. But some say bim milin, that it would grow with words, meaning they use magic in order to make it grow. So it was some kind of magic food where they took these soaked parsleys and all these things. The point for our halacha is that because they never cooked it, they just soaked it in warm water, it's considered to be, even Rashi says, even if they did cook it and heat it up, it's not considered bishul akum because it can be eaten raw by just soaking the seeds. And again, the principle is anything that can be eaten raw is not a problem of bishul akum. Tanur Abanan continues the Braita with another sort of complicated case. Where are we up to? I don't know, around 10 lines down into the middle wide lines. Says the Braita kuspan. Now kuspan, which is Rashi explains that they would take dates, they would turn their dates into beer, right? And after they were done, they had basically the dates themselves that were crushed and were flattened. They would take those and they would turn them into things that you would cook. So if you take kuspan of chavim and huchmu, right, and you heat them up, chamav biyoreg gedula, you heat them into a big pot. You cook them. I guess they can make something. You could rehydrate them. If it's in a big pot, it's asur. Then it's prohibited. And the Gemara explains, Rashi explains, because they could put other things in that pot. So you don't know what else was there. It might have been that there was food that was not kosher. But if it's a yurek tanah, if it's a small pot and they couldn't put anything in it besides these dates, then it's mutar. Because hence you don't need to. It's a big why, but let's just say it's because you don't need to cook them anymore. So and therefore it's permitted. Asks the Gemara, what's a big pot? What's a small pot? Is he yorek tana? What's a small pot? Rabbi Yanai says Rabbi Yanai, you can't get a small bird. Tzipor dror means a bird that flies. Mine translated as swallows, but very small birds can't get into the pot, meaning there's a very narrow opening, and so therefore you can't put not kosher food, and you can't put any food into it. It's just pure dates. Ask the Gemara, maybe they took non-kosher food and they cut it up and they sliced it and they put in pieces. Ella, what it means is in rosh tzipor dror, where even the head, which is the smallest part of the bird, I guess, can't fit into this thing. So meaning it has a very narrow opening, only liquids can get into it, and therefore it is it is permitted if it's pure date oil, dates in there. Asking about Tanya, but there's another brayta that says that whether you put these dates into a big pot or a small pot, you could eat them. Why does this brayta say a big pot's okay? This actually is dependent on the machloket about whether food makes a bad taste, it would be permitted or prohibited. Because the goal here is to make these dates. It could be that they'll put in something in the pot that was cooked yesterday for chicken or for meat or for pig or whatever. But that's considered notein tam lifgam. That's considered to be giving a taste that doesn't improve the thing. And that's a machloket, whether that's permitted or prohibited. If you say it's permitted, then any size pot would be okay. If you say it's prohibited, then only a small pot, not a big pot. Amar Rav Sheshet, now says Rav Sheshet in a not similar, but in a related cooking halacha, Mishcha shlika de armai asor. If you have oil that is cooked by a aramai, by a non-Jew, or Avodah Avodah Zarah, is prohibited. Says the Gemara, Amar of Safra, my nechishla. Well, again, why are you worried about oil? What's not kosher about oil? If you're worried they're going to put wine into it, and wine came from Yain Nesach, Misra Sari, as we said before, right? Wine ruins oil. And so if you put wine in, it's going to get rotten. If it's because he cooked it, who cares if he cooked it? You eat oil raw. You can eat it raw. So the fact that he cooked it is not a problem. If it's because he's going to put his pig juice into it, right? The pot is not kosher. That doesn't matter. So it should be permitted. It's not a problem because you don't want the taste of non-kosher meat in your oil, right? That ruins it. And therefore, it would be permitted according to this opinion. Now, Rav Asi, they asked Rav Asi, Mahani ahini shliki darmai. What about these? This is the case we had earlier, these boiled dates that are made by a non-Jew, right? This one, now, first of all, chulye, right? If they're very sweet dates, right? Then lo tibailach, it's not a problem. Tivade shari, it's for sure permitted because you'll eat the dates without cooking them, right? They're edible raw because they're sweet. Mariri, if they're very bitter and they're not edible raw, you have to cook them. Then lo tibailach tivade asiri, then for sure you can't eat them because you have to cook them in order to make them edible. Ki tibailach mitzia. The question here was about intermediate dates that are a little bit raw, a little bit bitter, a little bit not bitter. And you asked Amalu, so you basically said, these get better by cooking them, but you could potentially eat them not cooked, I guess hard with the difficulty. So what's the halacha? Amalu, he said to him, well, I don't know, why are you asking me? Mati bailach, why are you asking the question? The Rebbe Asar, our teacher said that this is prohibited. And money, who's our teacher? Levi. So you should already know this halacha. It's a famous halacha of Levi, that you're not allowed to eat dates that are somewhat edible, that are cooked by a non-Jew, because that makes them truly edible. Now, what about the meal of shetita? We are the seventh, I guess, last of the middle lines, right? Shetita. Now, shetita was a porridge that they would make by using grain and honey. Okay, so they really didn't cook anything in the shetita. They roasted the grains. We had earlier that was okay. They would mix honey into it and then they would cook it up. So what's the halacha there? So Rav says pshari. Rav says that's fine if a non-Jew makes it. And Avuah de Shmuel v'Levi asri. And the father of Shmuel and Levi, who are in Bavel, said it's prohibited. Now says the Gemara, let's just clarify. Bechiti useiri kuli amal pligi deshari. If you're talking about wheat or barley, everyone agrees that it's okay. And we're going to explain as we go on that the issue here was that sometimes they would add vinegar to this shetita to make it taste better. Vinegar, of course, has wine, and vinegar would prohibit it. So if it's made out of chitim and saor, and out of grain, what's chitim? Flour, wheat and barley, then everyone agrees that it's permitted because they don't put vinegar into it. So you know the ingredients, and it's not considered to be cooking because shetita is made with popped kernels, and therefore those are not considered cooked. So if it's chiti and sari, everyone agrees that it's permitted if it's made by a non-Jew. B'tlavchi the challah, if it's made in tlavchi, tlavchi are like lentils that's made with vinegar, then kuli amalo pligi de aser because of the vinegar. Ki pligi b'tlavchi demai. If you have lentils that are made with water, so they're made, healthy, and they don't use the vinegar. The question is, mar savar gazunin ha'atuha. Rav says Avodah Shmuel and Levi say it's prohibited because gozer lentils made in water because many times the lentils are made in vinegar. And Rav says you don't make a gzera. Some have a version that in fact, if they're lentils made in water, it's still prohibited because it's a lot like the lentils made in vinegar. The question is one level down. What if it's wheat or barley where they never use vinegar, but it looks a lot like the vinegar dish? Levi and Avodah Shmuel say you make a gzera. And Rav says you don't make a gzera. Now, Amar Rav, says Rav, actually, it's very interesting. If you recall, there was a story in Shmuel Bet, where Avshalom, rebels against David, and David has to run away for his life, and he leaves Israel, and he's, out in Ever Yarden, and Barzillai Giladi sends him food, right? Says Rav, if you analyze the pasuk in Shmuel Bet, there's Trei Mini Shatita Shadar Barzillai Giladi David. Barzillai Giladi sent this dish called Shatita, which again is roasted grains and honey. There were two different types that he sent to David. Because the pasuk says, it says in Shmuel, Barzillai Giladi sent the following: Mishkav, which means beds, the sapot and containers, klei yotzer, earthenware, kalim of chitin usorin, the kemach the kali, right? Barley and flour, wheat, flour, kali is fine ground flour, upul, which are beans, adashim, different kind of beans, vikali, and things that are roasted, meaning roasted beans or roasted grains, right? And the pasuk continues, right? Well, sorry, and the basically, because it says kemach vikali and it says adashim vikali, it means that there were roasted kemach and there was roasted adashim. And hashta de mapki tzani the shuka dinarda. Now that you go out and they sell these shatita in baskets full in the shuk of Naharda, let the chayish le Avodah Shmuel Levi. Nobody worries anymore about the opinion of Avodah Shmuel and Levi that they're prohibited, and we rely on Rav that says that it's permitted to have shtita as long as you are confident that it's the kind of shtita where a non-Jew did not put what's called vinegar into it, and therefore it would be permitted. So nowadays nobody worries, I guess in Naharda, about this opinion of Avodah Shmuel and Levi, and we permit shtita as long as it's made without vinegar. So we'll stop there. Shukoach. These, as you can see, halachot are very practical, very relevant, and very time dependent, right? What's the practice in that place? Sunday's daf is daf lamed tet. As I said in the beginning, I recorded Sunday's daf because I'm not going to be able to teach it live. I did it like 6 hours ago, and Charlie's going to help us figure out how to upload that recording, I hope.
Okay, do you have a file with the recording?
I do. I did it on the Zoom.
Okay,
Miriam, do you know how to do it by any chance?
yeah, so let me.
I don't know how to do it. You need to be an admin to be able to do it. And I'm not an admin. So,
Well, I'll put it on the chat, or Stephen, I'm sure, is an admin or someone in the shul office, and hopefully they can upload it. Send the link. I wish it was better. Let me just say, we'll talk about this on the chat during the week, but next Motzaei Shabbat is Tisha B'Av, so we can't learn. But it occurred to me that we probably could learn, though it won't work for everyone, on Shabbat afternoon. We have to just make sure the rabbis are okay with that, but they should be. I think we've done this in the past. There's a little debate about learning on Erev Tisha B'Av if it's Shabbat. I mean, I don't think there's any debate, but I'm not sure if others disagree. Because otherwise I could record for Motzaei. I could record both, of course, but Motzaei Tisha B'Av we can learn if people want to, but we can't learn on Tisha B'Av. So, so we'll touch base on the chat.
great.
All right, so I'm going to another device because I can't do it on this Android device.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Servot tov, everyone.
Shavua tov. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so hold on. Connecting. All right, I'm going to go to my own account and see how this works.